Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Artificial intelligence could help agencies modernize outdated regulations. But a leaked Trump administration proposal may push reform past the point of legality. Smart use of AI requires an understanding of the complexity of regulations and the unintended consequences of deregulation. Here to explain how best to deploy AI responsibly for this purpose is founder of the GW Regulatory Study Center and former OIRA administrator, Susan Dudley. Susan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with you, Terry.
You are a longtime advocate for smarter regulation and regulatory reform. I want to start by getting your general thoughts about the Trump administration's plan to use AI to review existing regulations.
We saw a leaked slide deck from July recently, and I wrote about that in a recent Forbes column. And I think it's very bold and aggressive. So the slide deck suggests that they will use AI, and using AI, they will be able to reduce the quantity of existing regulation by half. And my conclusion reviewing that deck is that it's rather naive.
Not all regulation is bad, but there is a lot of it. As you're thinking about reviewing regulation, do you see a positive role for AI? How can it help?
Yes, I think AI can be very valuable. It can be useful for screening existing regulations, comparing statutory requirements to the regulatory requirements. So that initial screen, I think, could be extremely valuable. I think it can also be useful for reviewing public comments because regulations have to go through notice and comment, and screening through and sorting and categorizing what could be hundreds of thousands of comments. I think AI will be able to do that very efficiently. And I would also love to see AI, new techniques, but also more traditional AI tools, evaluate whether regulations are actually achieving their expected effects.
How would you see AI deployed to address some of the challenges that are inherent in, a broad-based regulatory review?
AI in Virginia, they have used AI to look at the statutory requirements that the regulatory agencies face and evaluate to what extent do the regulations go beyond those requirements. That's a first step. Then Virginia, then real people, the policy officials, the lawyers, the analysts, then will look at that list and say, oh, well, there are very good reasons for going beyond the statutory mandate, and here's why. But it also highlights cases where maybe it wasn't thought through and that within the bounds of their statutory authority, they can cut back on some regulations. Another thing they're doing in Virginia that I think is valuable is a comparative look at what other nearby states are doing. So they find if, for example, they require hair braiders to go through 100 hours of training, whereas another state may require 30 or 50, to step back and say, why are we doing it differently? And can we make it easier for small businesses and others to thrive in our state?
So some basic comparisons, some look at frameworks, some pointing out where there are outliers. Those are the kinds of things where you think it's a useful tool.
Yes, I think it can be extraordinarily valuable.
What are some of the things that you think AI shouldn't be used to do?
It should not be used to draft the regulation. It certainly should be not be used without careful human involvement. So not just a human to maybe check it at the end, but you need a human every step of the way. The regulatory process is a complicated and time-consuming legal process that requires first, yes, looking at the statutory authority, but then also doing substantive fact-based analysis. And that's something where AI can help, but you really need humans to evaluate. I think the other thing about the regulatory system is that it's often litigated. So agencies will issue a final regulation. And I know, as you know well, the courts, their parties may sue and courts will intervene. What courts will be doing is evaluating, if you're deregulating, evaluate the supporting documentation you provided for the new rule and compare it to what was provided before. A sloppy or briefly written AI The support document is not going to be able to compare to hundreds of thousands of pages that maybe have been available in the original.
I'm speaking with Susan Dudley. She's the founder of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Susan, with those sorts of caveats in mind, you mention in your Forbes article some real concern about the DOJ assertion that they could reduce the time to deregulate by 93%. Tell me about your concerns with that number.
I mean, I think they do identify a real problem, but I think first they're optimistic about the fraction of regulations that are not required or are not mandated. So there have been recent Supreme Court decisions that say that agencies need to adhere more closely to their the authority that the statutory language grants them. But this 50% would suggest that agencies overreached in 50% of the regulations that are on the books. And I think that's probably overstating things. I think it also ignores the need for a record to support the new regulation. And we know that agencies need to provide just as robust a record to deregulate as they did to regulate, per State Farm decision from 40 or so years ago. And that includes both the legal record to support the new legal interpretation, but also the substantive, factual, scientific record. And I think that's what seems to be missing from at least what I understand of the DOJ plan.
So assuming they're going to go forward with using AI to deregulate, and those slides have a pretty tight timeline, end of September, early October, what would you suggest that they put in place as an oversight mechanism to make sure that they don't make some of the mistakes that you just articulated?
I think they need to pay careful attention to the litigation risk. So they may succeed. So as you say, we should be seeing deregulation proposals being rolled out in the Federal Register now, September and October, according to that schedule. And then a quick turnaround in the agencies after responding to 30 or 60 days of public comment, and then final regulations issued by January 20th, 2026. So as you say, it's a very aggressive time schedule and bold goal. And even if they achieve that deadline, I think what they're forgetting is that what comes next is the litigation. And will that record that they've developed stand up to judicial scrutiny? And I think it won't unless they put more time and care in the drafting of those revisions.
How much of a market disruption would you anticipate with 50% deregulation and in so short a period of time? How will businesses and agencies adapt to such a perhaps sweeping change in the regulatory structure?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I suspect that in many cases they won't. For regulations that have been in place for a while, they're part of business practices. Companies are not going to say, oh, we'll no longer provide disclosure for certain things because it's part of good business practice. So there may be some regulations that are purely burdensome and don't have significant benefits. And I could see companies being willing to no longer comply with those. But yes, I think it won't be as big a disruption, or the benefits that the Trump administration might expect by deregulating may be much less because these are already part of the way people do business.
Do you think there are areas where deregulation could go too far, especially in areas that are associated with public safety, public well-being?
I tend to believe in that the incentives are there to protect your customers, to protect citizens. And, especially we talked about litigation, but you would face a lot of liability if you did things that you knew would be hazardous. So I'm probably less concerned than some might be on that ground. Yeah.
What advice would you have for policymakers and legislators who really want to pursue modernization using AI? Are there particular guardrails that you'd want to make sure they put in place before they start?
I think they really need to think through the unintended consequences and the implications of changes. So you might see AI might identify one area that's not required by statute or not mandated, but what are the connections with other parts of the regulatory system? Now, that going back to your first question, Terry, that's something that I could see AI might do well, is to look at all those connections and identify areas where some regulations may be in conflict with others. I mean, you do hear that sometimes from small businesses. I can't do this because one regulation tells me I have to do something and the other tells me the opposite. But we could create those inconsistencies if they're not careful.
Sounds like you wind up back where many advisors do with AI, which is people need to be in the loop.
Yes. I think that's right. I think you really need experts for both the legal and the policy arguments.
I've been speaking with Susan Dudley. She's the founder of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Susan, thanks for helping us parse through those really complicated arguments.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule and your device. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.